12 on the nose. So we're gonna jump in. I am so glad to see you all here. My name is Lauren. I'm the community historian here, and I am so excited about this presentation. Kate is an incredible supporter of the Western Heritage Center, and to have her drive all the way from Helena today, not only for this presentation, but tonight at 6 o'clock, in partnership with Art House, we are offering a free screening of Hidden Stories, Montana's Black Past, which is a celebrated documentary through Montana PBS. And Kate, who actually served as one of the executive producers for the documentary, is going to be joining us so that she can answer questions afterwards, which is just a wonderful, wonderful thing for her to be willing to do. Before I jump in too far, I do want to encourage everybody. We do have walking tours and other programs on our calendar. Check it out. It's going to be great. In fact, you should pull out your phones and mark them in the calendar now. There are still a couple of spots in tomorrow's walking tour. And while you have your phone out, go ahead and hit the silent button on it. Today's presentation is going to be live streamed, and so having somebody's phone go off in the middle of the presentation is a little distracting for everybody. So Kate is the Deputy State Historic Preservation Officer and historian at the Montana Historical Society's State Historic Preservation Office, as well as being a wonderful friend to us here at the Western Heritage Center. She currently works with the local community preservation programs to document and preserve their cultural resources. Her past work includes several years with Preserve Montana as the director of the Most Endangered Places program, coordinating Montana's National Register of Historic Places program, and working through the West as a research historian with Historic Research Associates. She directs the Montana African American Heritage Resources projects, which identify, research, and document resources and places throughout the state associated with African American history in Montana. And those stories are absolutely incredible. I'm so excited to have them, to be able to share them with you guys today. She served, as I mentioned, as the executive producer and co-writer of the documentary Hidden Stories, Montana's Black Past, and she authored The Best Gift, Montana's Carnegie Libraries, as well as numerous other books, chapters, articles, essays, on and on and on and on. So please join me in welcoming Kate for her presentation today.
Thank you. You're very sweet. Hello, can everybody hear me? I will try very hard to keep this up at my mouth, but I have to read, turn pages, move slides, and try and be delightful. So all of that together might be a little overwhelming. Thanks so much to Lauren for that wonderful introduction. This is one of my favorite places in the world to be, and it's an honor to be here tonight. So again, my name is Kate. I've been working with African American history in Montana for about 20 years. And the story I tell is I had just started working at the Montana Historical Society and was at Great Falls for a luncheon meeting. And just sitting at the table, you know, kind of new to my job, not knowing what end was what. And a gentleman came up where I was sitting at the table and pulled me by the elbow and said, "You need to come with me." And I did. I mean, my mother probably would have been horrified, but I just got into the car with this gentleman that said, "You need to come with me." And I did, and that gentleman's name was Mr. Guy. And Frank Guy was the elder at the African Methodist Episcopal Church in Great Falls, the Union Bethel Church. And he brought me to that church and he said, "This place is important. How are we going to preserve this place and make sure its legacy continues?" And that's how I got started. Almost immediately after my start with the Montana Historical Society, I started working with Mr. Guy, Mr. Harris, also from Great Falls, who was the former director of the NAACP there. And what we wanted to do first, not only was stabilize the church, which we did, thank goodness, but we also wanted to identify what objects the state of Montana had that we could contribute to the Smithsonian's yet to be built African American History Museum in Washington, D.C. There was a group of folks that really wanted to make sure that Montana had a presence there in that National Museum. And so that's how this whole big project started, where we really needed to identify what we had at the Montana Historical Society and then across the state associated with Black history, and make sure that we could not only identify it, but make sure it was available to folks across the nation for research, for families, for oral histories, all sorts of stuff. So that's kind of how this journey began. And I think one of the important things, kind of the foundational things to understand about Black history in Montana is that a lot of it was legislated. A lot of it had to do with laws and policies. And so the presentation today hopefully will give us a good overview of those laws and policies that affected many minority groups, but most significantly African Americans. So that's what I'm going to be talking about today. So let's see if I can coordinate all of my appendages here and get going. So since the time of the first non-Indian presence, African Americans have played a significant part in shaping the cultural landscape of what would become Montana. Unfortunately, most of our history books, essays, and articles fail to acknowledge the influences upon and the influences of Montana's Black past. Not only is it important to understand the role African American people have had and continue to have in the state's social, political, and commercial development, but also how local, statewide, and national events, laws, and policies informed those experiences. So I always have to kind of say who I'm indebted to. And a woman named Glenda Rose Spearman Aridata researched, compiled, and contextualized Montana's laws for a master's thesis in the political science department at the University of Montana in 1981. This, together with Jay Smur's Jim Crow Out West article, which was published in 1957, was incredibly important and groundbreaking scholarship that until my friend Anthony Wood, who started as an intern on the Black History Project at the Historical Society, he went on and got his PhD in Black history from the University of Michigan and wrote Black Montana, which is really a fantastic published book that's an overview of the history of Black experiences in the state. So if you're looking for a good book that's gonna give you a good overview of all of this, I would suggest that one by Anthony Wood. Anthony's book offers a whole new perspective, exhaustive research, and invaluable insight. So to understand Montana's legal history, it's important to know how Montana Territory developed. The United States carved Montana Territory from Idaho Territory in 1864. And if you look at all of these maps, you can see how convoluted these boundaries were for the different territories through the early 1960s, as everybody was kind of jostling for position. Idaho Territory had been established just the year before in 1863. Congress carved it from the eastern portion of Washington Territory and the western portions of Dakota Territory and Nebraska Territory, so that Idaho Territory in 1863 encompassed all of the land that is now included in the states of Idaho and Montana, plus a little bit of what is now Wyoming. These boundaries lasted little more than a year, and in 1864, Congress created the Montana Territory. Most of what is the state of Wyoming got transferred back to the Dakota Territory at that time. All of this to say, suddenly we're a territory in 1864 and we need some laws, right? So the Montana's first legislature just chose to adopt Idaho's laws almost in its entirety. They decided to use Idaho Territory law as the framework for Montana's. And so let's start with a relatively positive example of good laws in Montana Territory when it was first established in 1864. And the first one was, as in Idaho, Montana Territory did not allow people to be taken from the territory to enslave them, so that's good. We appreciate that. The law established that, quote, every person who shall forcibly steal, take, arrest a man, woman, or child, either a white or colored or any Indian in this territory, and carry him or her into another county, state, or territory, or shall forcibly take or arrest any person or persons whatsoever with the design to take him or her out of this territory without having established a claim according to federal law, important little caveat there, shall, upon conviction, be deemed guilty of kidnapping. The law carried a penalty of no less than a year, but no more than 10 years of prison time. Notice the caveat I said, without having an established claim according to the laws of the United States. So 2 years earlier, in the summer of 1862, Congress took the following actions regarding slavery. First, it abolished slavery in the District of Columbia and the federal territories, of which Montana was one. It authorized the confiscation of people enslaved by Confederates. It formally freed all enslaved people who escaped to the United States Army. It prohibited the Army from returning fugitive enslaved people, authorized the enlistment of black soldiers, and created public schools for African American children in the District of Columbia. So all that happened in 1862. And then, this day that we're celebrating today, this event, President Abraham Lincoln issued the Emancipation Proclamation on September 22nd, 1862, to take effect on January 1st, 1863, declaring that, quote, all persons held as slaves within the rebellious states are and henceforward shall be free. While the federal Fugitive Slave Acts were repealed in June of 1864, Montana's first legislature kept that language, that except where federal law might have a different opinion, language in the Montana law, just in case the federal laws changed, because everything was in flux at that time. Notably, in 1865, the 13th Amendment abolished slavery and involuntary servitude in the United States, except as punishment for a crime. There's always a little caveat in there, right? That exception remains, though there have been recent movements to drop that exception in Colorado in 2018 and Utah and Nebraska in 2020. But it's still in effect here in Montana. You can still enforce labor as punishment for a crime. And that's the justification, right, for chain gangs, essentially. In Montana and other states, that exception, that servitude may be required as punishment for a crime, has been used to defend the use of prison labor. And from 1913 to 1926, convict labor constructed 280 miles of road in this state. Prisoners constructed the walls around the state prison in Deer Lodge as well. And so this photograph of that road, does anybody know where that is by any chance? I always like to quiz people on Montana geography. It's hard to see. Say it one more time.
Is that on Yellowstone Lake?
It is the Yellowstone River. Very good. It's right outside of Livingston. And this road is actually called Convict Grade, right? You've driven on that road, and it's because it was constructed by prison labor, taking advantage of this caveat of the law that says, except for punishment as a crime, right? And you can drive on that road today. It's actually quite lovely. And listed in the National Register of Historic Places if you want to learn more. So, again, I digress. So back to the first territorial legislature. We find that the Montana territorial law had a lot to say about who and who could not vote. It was pretty straightforward. Only white male citizens 21 or older could vote in federal, territorial, and local political elections. The law also restricted school district votes to, quote, every white male inhabitant over the age of 21 years who shall pay or be liable to pay any district tax shall be a legal voter in the school. Just to be sure, they added, quote, no other person shall be allowed to vote. So they just wanted to make sure that nobody else was going to try and get in there. This limitation will come into play when we discuss school segregation. So Congress considered and sent the 14th Amendment to be ratified by the states in 1866. This amendment not only recognized African Americans as citizens, but also said that states could not abridge the privileges or immunities of the citizens of the United States, nor shall any state deprive any person of life, liberty, property without the due process of law, nor deny any person within its jurisdiction the equal protections of the laws. By 1867, the first Reconstruction Act required former Confederate states to allow African American men to vote. And in the same year, Congress passed the Territorial Suffrage Act, giving black men in the territories the right to vote. And of course, that's going to come into play in Montana. Same year we become, I'm sorry, just 3 years after we become a territory, 1867, Montana's going to open suffrage to black men as well as white men. So the city of Helena, Montana experimented with African American voting in their 1867 elections, and members of the local Republican Party encouraged black people to go to the polls. However, local Democrats and white bullies intimidated and threatened violence against the prospective voters. An Irish rioter named John Leach murdered Sammy Hayes in the melee. And according to Smir, the marshal had to fight his way through the hostile crowd who were trying to protect the murderer and take that man to the courthouse. So John Leach stayed in jail awaiting trial until February of 1868, so about 6 months later, when he and 2 other prisoners escaped. I didn't find any mention of, I couldn't find him anywhere in the record after that, so we assume he got away with it and went and took up life elsewhere. So, you know, voting, suffrage and voting rights aren't the same as being able to vote, right? In 1867, the state codes confirmed that only white men could vote legally in Montana. So that was before, I'm sorry, the Territorial Suffrage Act. The 1867 laws also, by the way, confirmed that chain gangs were legal even at the local level. Forced labor prisoners could be punished with solitary confinement and limited to bread and water if they refused. So the 14th Amendment, remember, granted black people citizenship in 1868, but it didn't guarantee suffrage. So it didn't mean that they could definitely vote. That would have to wait until 1870 with the 15th Amendment. And in Montana, the 1871-1872 code extended voting rights to all male citizens. As elsewhere in the United States, incidents of voter intimidation and suppression continued, and continue now, to plague Montana. In 1864, I'm sorry, I know this is a lot of dates. We'll get through it. I always thought that this was really interesting. The territorial laws restricted how African Americans could participate in legal proceedings. So to help everyone understand exactly who was who and who could do what under the law, the law in Montana in 1864 defined mulatto people as those, quote, who shall have 1/8 part or more Negro blood. Every person who shall have 1/2 Indian blood shall also be deemed an Indian. So African Americans, Chinese, and Native American residents of the states could not testify at trials involving white litigants. They weren't allowed to testify. They could, however, provide witness accounts of trials involving members of their own race. So they could participate in trials if you were Chinese American and the person on trial was Chinese American, then you could participate in the trial, but not if one of the people was white, essentially. So while the restrictions on witnesses disappeared from the Montana codes in 1872, the legislature retained that the law that provided that only white men could serve as jurors and serve summons. So you might be able to serve as a witness now, but you still couldn't serve on a jury. So the 14th and 15th Amendments ushered in a wave of legal revisions. As we've seen, at least on the surface, the 1872 Montana Territorial Codes repealed restrictions on African American participation in voting and legal proceedings. However, as some rights were established, others were taken away. And in 1872, Montana passed a school segregation law. A lot of people don't realize that. So here I'll borrow from my friend Delia Hagen, who is a wonderful historian of Black history in Montana. So what became known as the segregation bill was initially introduced in 1872 in the House by a man who was originally from New York, a man named Daniel Searles. When the Legislative Council considered the bill, that provided for the segregation of black school children, Granville Stewart, who had an indigenous wife and children, spearheaded the review. He made sure that if there were going to be segregated schools, that those would only be segregated for African American kids, not for Indian kids, because his kids were half Indian. And then his kids wouldn't be able to go to school. So he kind of helped shepherd this law through the legislature. For the most part, the debates over the bill reflected the legislators' shared anti-black racism and seemed to center on practical or legal issues rather than moral ones. When it came to legal authority, legislators argued that the 14th Amendment didn't apply to territories, so, quote, a territory could legislate stringently against non-whites. But legislating segregation and putting it into consistent practice is very, very different. Almost nowhere in the territory was it financially practical to have two public schools, right? There was considerable controversy over whether and how to educate the few African American children in several towns. So Montana's segregation law was modeled on a California law that had passed 2 years earlier. And the bill allowed Montana school districts to, quote, build separate schools wherever there were more than 10 African American children. Notably, California's law codified segregation practices that had existed in the state prior to, or at least since 1866. So in California, they were already segregated and they put it into law. In Montana, schools were not segregated until 1872, and then the law said, you will create separate schools. So they were taking away a right that they had previously. School officials wasted no time trying to purge the few black children from the classrooms in their jurisdiction. In Deer Lodge, where the previous census showed only 15 black residents in the entire county, a woman named America Turner soon received notice from Granville Stewart, remember the guy who helped get this law through, and fellow district directors that her son was not entitled to a place at the public school and that he would not be admitted. Despite the teachers' protests and the students' dismissal, Granville Stewart, whose Native American children attended the same school, Stewart and his ilk prevailed. Other towns, too, purged black children from their primary schools. Virginia City had a short-lived separate schooling arrangement, as did Fort Benton. In Fort Benton, a black school reportedly opened in 1878, and then it closed in 1882. Thereafter, a conflict arose over the enrollment of a handful of black children in the public school for whites. 4 white families withdrew their children when 2 girls of partial African American descent were admitted to the school. Similar events unfolded in White Sulphur Springs, where the city's 4 African American children were denied entree to their local school. So efforts to segregate schools under this legislation really reached its fullest expression in Helena, the territorial capital and home of the largest African American community in the state at that time. That year, there were 19 school-aged children of African American descent in Helena, and some of these children's parents attempted to enroll them in the Hill Street School. In response, the Helena School Board reorganized the city's public schools and created the segregated South Side School for children of color. Creating an entire separate school for so few students proved expensive. The South Side School operated for 3 months during 1875 at an average cost of $50 per student versus an average of $10 for white schools. And so this is just a little Sanborn map of Helena, what we call the South Central District of Helena. It's one of the oldest residential districts in the city. And as Helena grew, this became kind of a neighborhood that had a lot of African American families, a lot of Chinese families, and working class people. So I don't know if you can see it. So kind of right northeast of the L in Hill is a little kind of pinkish colored in building. Can you see that one? Oh, right there. Do I have a laser pointer? Yes. Can I use it is the question. There, it's that guy. So that was the school, and it really was just a small log cabin in the middle of this community in Helena. So the Black community immediately began protesting the exclusion of its children, and in 1876, 106 Helena Black and white residents submitted one of many petitions to the Montana legislature to repeal the school segregation law. School segregation, they argued, was unnecessary and effectively barred Black children from an education. The House Education Committee rejected the petition, and the protests of the Black communities and its allies fell on deaf ears. The school segregation law and Helena's segregated Southside School remained in place until about 1882. So school segregation continued to be the law of the land actually until 1883. Though the law continued to appear in the codes, it was not enforced. And it doesn't disappear completely from the Montana codes until 1895, a year before Plessy versus Ferguson established separate but equal doctrines. Indeed, the late 1800s witnessed substantial violence, intimidation, and discrimination. After the turn of the century, Montana legislators codified many of these practices. Post-Reconstruction Montana was a place of segregation, and other racist structures and practices characterized life in the territory. One particular incident took place in Butte in 1881 and resulted in a state Supreme Court case that invoked the 14th Amendment. And that's what we're going to call the Chop House Affair. So a little bit of background. William Woodcock was a well-known and well-liked resident of Helena. He was born in Louisville, Kentucky in 1852. He arrived in Montana during the 1870s. He was a servant to Lieutenant Joshua Jacobs, who served at Fort Shaw. While at Fort Shaw, Woodcock participated as a civilian in the Battle of the Little Bighorn. The Battle of the Little Big Hole, very different, in 1877. And he married a woman named Teresa Lewis at the fort in 1878. Jacobs and the young couple moved with the 7th Infantry to Fort Snelling in Minnesota, but where they appear with their baby daughter Blanche in the 1880 census. But by 1881, they had returned to Montana, and this time to Helena, where Woodcock got a job as a servant to a man named Alexander Botkin. Mr. Botkin, Alexander Campbell Botkin, was a prominent Republican and had been the United States Marshal for the Montana Territory since 1878. And in 1880, he lost use of his legs as a result of an illness. He actually was exposed during a winter storm and got very sick and had to use a wheelchair for the rest of his life. But he remained active in law and politics, rising to lieutenant governor in 1893. But here's what happened in 1881. According to Mr. Woodcock, as told by the Butte Miner newspaper, on the September evening in 1881, Mr. Woodcock accompanied Mr. Botkin to dinner with Mr. Botkin's brother, who was a druggist in Butte. So they had come down from Helena to Butte, and they were going to have dinner at the Chop House, Mr. Botkin and his brother. So this was a very popular place, and it was kind of a communal style. So there were big tables, and everybody just kind of sat at whatever table had space for you. It was on the corner of Broadway and Main in Butte, if you know Main and Butte, but it no longer stands. Anyway, the party entered the building, and the brothers took a seat at the table just to the right of the entrance. Another party that included a gentleman named Sterrett Higgins and his friends seated themselves at the same table, leaving Mr. Woodcock without a seat. So Mr. Woodcock sat, even though he usually sat next to Mr. Botkin to help him eat and assist him during the meals, on this occasion, he took a seat at the nearest table so he would be close by, immediately to the left and in front of the door. There was a young man already at the table who left the table with expressions of disgust. According to Woodcock, the proprietor then told the waiter to tell Woodcock to leave the table and that he would not be served a meal. Colonel Botkin asked if there was any objection to Woodcock eating at his table, but Mr. Woodcock felt too aggrieved to eat and sat nearby waiting for Botkin's party to finish their meal. So then, Woodcock filed a civil claim in the U.S. Court at Deer Lodge under the 14th Amendment and the Civil Rights Act of 1875, asking for $500 in damages because he was denied equal privileges at the chop house with white persons. The district court decided in Woodcock's favor in December of 1883. The case was very interesting for a number of reasons. First of all, of course, that in this discriminatory atmosphere in Montana during the 1880s, the judge decided in his favor. That should have been big news, right? But the newspapers did not make a big deal of it. Mr. Smurr suggests that to do so would have encouraged others to sue, and that risked the case going to the territorial Supreme Court or even the US Supreme Court, something that most whites wanted to avoid. As it was, the case made little difference in how black people were treated in Montana, and indeed by the turn of the 20th century, things were only going to get worse. Isn't this a happy, uplifting talk? Are you enjoying this? It does get better, I promise. Oh, this is just a couple of a follow-up about Mr. Woodcock, that he seemed like the nicest guy and so well loved. There's tons of newspaper articles about William Woodcock. He lived the rest of his life in Helena. He owned a carpet cleaning business and a dry cleaning business. He was the leader of the Independent Colored Voters Club. He told great stories. He would like to hold court out of doors and tell of his adventures at the Battle of the Big Hole and his fishing prowess. He was the original big fish story guy. And he died just a year after his house and business burned down in Helena. So there actually isn't a physical place left in Helena to tell his story. So it's important that we have presentations like this so his story is told over and over again. So in her National Register document, African American Heritage Places, Delia Hagen explains that, quote, Woodcock's 1883 victory notwithstanding, discrimination in Montana continued to take both legal and illegal forms. Racism in the workplace relegated black people to low-wage, demanding jobs and kept them from and in certain industries. One of the largest employers in Montana was the Anaconda Company, and from its beginnings, the company, quote, did not hire black workers. During the 1894 Capitol fight, the Colored Citizen newspaper, which was one of 3 black newspapers published in the state, it was only published in 1894 in Helena, specifically during the Capitol fight. They were trying to convince the African American community in Helena to vote for Helena to be the capital, so they had this newspaper called the Colored Citizen. And in it, they claimed that while the Anaconda Company gave employment to thousands of men, not a single black citizen can be found among them. Yea, even more, we learned that none are allowed in our works, is the unanimous statement from those who controlled the company as well as those employed by the company. And Helena had its share of Jim Crowism. Several black people wrote to the Colored Citizen in 1894 complaining of and exposing Helena's restaurants' refusal to serve them. As Norman Crump Howard recalled, racism thrived in this period. He said blacks were excluded from nearly every restaurant in town and held low-paying jobs, and you better not go to a bar for a drink. Such racism was no secret. In July of 1908, the Plain Dealer, which was another black newspaper, reported that up at the head of Wall Street on Main, which is in Helena, is a little old cheap dirty restaurant with the nerve to put up a sign, quote, no colored trade solicited. So it seemed that unless a change was made, all of these public eating houses would ban black people. Such discrimination extended to other public places as well. Perdita Duncan of Butte recalled, you just kept out of certain places, and by the time I was coming along, there were just certain places I couldn't go, and I just never bothered. In Billings, when the city announced plans to build a new public swimming pool in 1914, white residents began making violent threats against any black residents who used the pool, and to circulate petitions demanding their exclusion. The park board subsequently forbade black people from swimming there except on Sunday when the pool was scheduled to be cleaned, and voting to, quote, exclude all Negroes and, quote, and open the new municipal natatorium to white people only. Mr. Walker Browning, one of Billings' black community leaders, wrote in a letter to the editor, quote, "I have been a resident of Billings for 32 years, and I have lived in the water from the Yellowstone River, and I do not think it would be seriously contaminated by a few of your people, human beings, whose chief desire would be a pleasant dip on a hot summer's day." But such discrimination endured and extended to other Billings public places as well. Billings residents, including Eunice Terry, recalled that well into the 1950s, Black residents weren't allowed to try on clothing in department stores, sit anywhere in the movie theaters, or swim in public pools unless the water would be clean the next day, as I said. There was a practice of discouraging minorities from buying property beyond certain areas of town. And a few months ago, our dear Kevin Koistra gave a great presentation about the architect Chandler Cohagen and the houses that he designed in the North Elevation and Grand View additions. And he worked so hard on this presentation. It was really great. And then one of the people that attended that lecture came back a couple of days later and said, "By the way, did you know that there are these covenants on our deeds that say, that are discriminatory?" And so he sent me an email with this scan of this deed of a house up in Grandview Addition that had a very long list of things you couldn't do. You couldn't have chickens, you couldn't have ducks, you couldn't have a bay window, but you also could not sell it to certain people. So developers Frank and Mary Jacoby, who were the developers of that whole Grandview Addition, placed restrictions on all properties in the neighborhood, including the prohibition of ownership, use, or occupation by, quote, Negroes, Chinese, Japanese, or Mexicans. So a lot of these discriminatory policies were never actually put into law. They were policies or riders on deeds or more kind of subliminal discrimination rather than, there was never an ordinance in Billings that said only certain people can live in this certain neighborhood. But there were these covenants on deeds, it's almost like redlining, right? Where you restricted people so much that there were only certain neighborhoods where they could own property. So, more happy things. Oh, that's Mr. Browning. Walker Browning is up here. I can push the button. And then this is Eunice Terry, who was a longtime resident of Billings. I think she passed away maybe about 8 years ago or so. But if you go to YouTube, her interview, if you type in Eunice Terry Billings, you can find her oral history, and it's just fascinating. What a dear lady. So during the first decades of the 20th century, Montana legislature did pass several Jim Crow laws intended to limit the rights of Black people and other minority groups. For example, in 1907, a new law prohibited non-members of fraternal organizations, including the Elks Club, from wearing those organizations' insignia in public. So if you were an elk, you weren't an elk, but you wore an elk pin, that would be against the law. And they put this law into effect because they didn't want certain people wearing insignias that looked like them, right? And so a lot of these fraternal organizations had corresponding clubs that were formed by either Black residents or Chinese residents. There were Chinese Masons, there were Black Elks, there were all these people, but the head chapters did not want others wearing those pins or insignia, which sounds really petty to me. And wow, the legislature really spent some time on this, for crying out loud. Well, in 1908, Helena musician William Holland was found guilty of wearing a diamond pin with the Elks insignia to his wedding at the courthouse. Though Holland said that the pin's insignia indicated his membership in the African American club called the Improved Benevolent and Protective Order of Elks of the World, the juries determined that the eye was too difficult to see on the pin. The case went to the Montana Supreme Court. He was at his wedding. They pulled him out of his wedding and put him in jail. The case went to the Montana Supreme Court, where the law was struck down as unconstitutional. Thank goodness. The court held The act, quote, is also obnoxious to the equal protection of the law clause of the 14th Amendment of the Federal Constitution, and further, that a statute which punishes one citizen for doing what another may do with impunity or abridges the liberty of one without imposing the like restriction upon the other does not furnish the equal protection of laws guaranteed by Section 1 of the 14th Amendment. So yay, Montana Supreme Court got rid of that stupid law. By the teens and 20s, the Ku Klux Klan resurged as a social force. Montana Klan held huge public events, parades 400 strong down the streets of Livingston, lectures in Butte that drew 1,300 people, and choreographed and flamboyant displays of strength, including cross burnings from Kalispell to Roundup. In 1923, the Billings Gazette described one impressive Klan event held during the 1923 Midland Empire Fair, where, quote, thousands of visitors were treated to a spectacle not advertised on the Governor's Day program. At 10 p.m. sharp, the city was aroused by a continuous bursting of air bombs over the high rim rocks that surround the northern part of the city. This was followed a little later by the bursting into flames of a cross nearly 50 feet high, the fiery cross of the KKK. As the cross blazed, lighting the entire top of the hills for miles around, hundreds of red flares were touched off, and at the edge of the hills, 300 yards above the city, marched hundreds of white-robed members of the organization carrying red and green flaming torches. Some 2,000 members were said to have participated. And in Missoula, at their AME church, their black church, local members of the Klan came in on multiple occasions and just marched during services, just marched down the center aisle and marched out just to show their presence and to intimidate. So the idea of banning interracial marriage in Montana began with that first territorial legislature. In 1864, the Idaho Territory disallowed marriages and cohabitation between white people and African Americans, Chinese, and Native American people, though the law allowed for the marriages established before the law went into effect. So if you were already married, that was okay, but moving forward, they weren't going to do it. When writing the Montana laws for the same year, Representative A.E. Mayhew introduced Bill number 19, which mirrored the Idaho law. Though initially passed by the Judiciary Committee, Granville Stewart, there's that guy again, who was married to a Native American woman named Aubani Tokara Stewart, and other legislators rejected the bill on the third reading, sending it back to committee where it died. And they tried again in 1866, but the similar bill failed. Although the bill failed to become law, interracial couples certainly experienced discrimination and even violence. In 1893, in Glendive, Montana, John Orr, a white man, married Emma Wall, a black woman, and a mob of white residents surrounded the couple, stripped off their clothes, painted John black using lamp black, and Emma white using albastine. The mob gave the couple 24 hours to leave town. The anti-miscegenation issue rose again when Senator Muffley, who lived in Winston, Montana, introduced Bill 71 into the 1907 Montana legislature. It would have banned marriages between white people and African American, Chinese, Japanese, and Native American people. In 1909, he tried again, a similar bill, but this one didn't include Native Americans on the list. After much debate and political maneuvering, the bill became law, and the Anti-Miscegenation Act of 1909 made it illegal for whites to marry or cohabitate with African American, Chinese, or Japanese people, and penalized those who performed such marriages. The 1921 Montana Miscegenation Code went farther. It targeted individual interracial interaction, nullified marriages of interracial couples who wed in jurisdictions that permitted such unions. So not only people who had been previously married, their marriages were called null and void, but if they got married in, say, Washington State and moved to Montana, Montana would not recognize their marriage as valid. And that's going to come into play here in a minute. So just to give you an idea of how this, it was affected a lot of people in a lot of devastating ways, but here's a little documentation that can show what kind of direct implications this code had. So there was a woman named Maud Healy who lived in Livingston, Montana, and she lived there with her Irish husband, Thomas, but he had died by 1900. And she appears in the census as living on South D Street with her 3 children, who are also identified as Black. Through the next census, family members are identified as mulatto and eventually as white. Interestingly, the children had white spouses, begging the question if they rejected their African American heritage in exchange for their marriages. So the Montana Supreme Court upheld the law, the anti-miscegenation law, in 1943's Shun Takahashi estate case. Mr. Takahashi was born in Japan and moved to Montana in 1912. He married Vivian Barker in Spokane in 1915. And when he died in 1941 without a will, the state refused to grant his wife standing in the probate proceedings. The court ruled that their marriage was void according to state law. So again, held up this discriminatory law. But there's some good news. During the late 19th and first half of the 20th century and beyond, several organizations worked for the uplift of Black people in Montana. Black churches, social clubs, and fraternities provided safe space for groups to gather. 3 Black newspapers in the state provided news, local, state, and national news in Helena and Butte. They were the Plain Dealer, the Colored Citizen, and the New Age. Baptist, African Methodist, Episcopal, and other churches, for example, provide not only religious guidance, but spaces to organize fundraisers, hold meetings, and provide a venue for sharing information. In 1888, Reverend James Hubbard of the Canvas Conference of the African Methodist Episcopal Church formally founded Helena's St. James AME Church congregation. And that, along with Butte's AME and Portland Bethel, also were some of the earliest AME churches in the Pacific Northwest. And AME churches thrived in several Montana cities: Helena, Anaconda, Butte, Bozeman, Havre, Missoula, and of course Billings. In Billings, the African American residents were restricted by social constructs rather than ordinance to owning property on the city's south side. And when the congregation of Billings AME Church purchased a building several blocks north of the railroad tracks, the neighborhood's northern boundary, community members literally picked the building up and moved the structure intact 11 blocks south to 402 South 25th Street in the heart of the Black neighborhood. Wayman AME Chapel still stands at that location today. And the Billings and Great Falls AME congregations remain active. The Montana Federation of Colored Women's Clubs, whose motto was, and I love this, lifting as we climb, worked to promote education, the family, and the status of Black women in the home and in the community. Established in 1922, the Federation consisted of clubs across the state, and in Billings it was the Phyllis Wheatley Club, founded in 1920. This statewide organization had a significant impact on the lives of African Americans in Montana. They fought to quell prejudice in the community, pushed for civil rights legislation at the Capitol, helped dozens of Black students pay for college, and like many Black groups, the club's membership and its physical location were in close proximity to the AME and Black Baptist churches of Montana's cities and towns. These pockets of self-segregated civic life, African Americans harbored and nurtured leadership and self-expression in the face of institutional racism. Here's a picture of the Phyllis Wheatley Club of Billings in 1922, and it includes members of the Hambright, Adams, Emmons, Bivens, Raymond, Epperson, Brown, Jones, Stradwick, Osserman, and McCabe families. In all of these pictures that we have for the Montana Federation of Colored Women's Clubs, we have that collection at the Historical Society in Helena, and we see so many of these faces, not only in the 1922 pictures when the Federation was established, but all the way up to 1972 when the Federation closed. See if you can see anybody's faces in there. So the Montana Federation of Colored Women's Clubs took an active role in lobbying for equal rights and non-discrimination laws at the state and local level. Their archives reveal their efforts to influence and encourage the legislature to take up anti-discrimination bills. And in 1951, House Bill 58 sought to prohibit certain practices of discrimination by employers, employment agencies, labor organizations, and others because of race, color, creed, national origin, or ancestry, and creating a Montana Fair Employment Practices Commission, defining its functions, powers, and duties, and providing for its procedure, enforcement, and judicial review, and imposing penalties. So this bill in 1951 lost on the floor vote, 32 in favor, 42 against. Also in 1951, the legislature considered a bill to guarantee full and equal employment in all places, or enjoyment of all places of public accommodation, so making sure that you couldn't discriminate who could stay at a hotel, for example. That also did not pass. But a few years later, in 1955, an anti-discrimination in accommodations law, very similar to the 1951 law, did pass, though virtually all of the original language and crucially, all of the penalties were stripped from the bill. So this said you couldn't do it, but then there was no consequence if you did. As we've seen, discrimination in accommodations continued well after the law went into effect and continues today. Various groups, including the League of Women Voters, included African American members and worked on a number of issues, including equal rights, fair housing, and social justice. These issues were addressed at the 1972 Montana Constitutional Convention, where the Constitution did not include an equal rights amendment. Article 2 of an Article 2 section does declare that, quote, the dignity of the human being is inviolable. No person shall be denied equal protection under the laws. Neither the state nor any person, firm, corporation, or institution shall discriminate against any person in the exercise of his civil or political rights on account of race, color, sex, culture, social origin or condition, or political or religious ideas. That fabulous document that is the 1972 Montana Constitution. In 1974, Montana enacted the Human Rights Act, which further enumerated and codified anti-discrimination laws. So Geraldine Travis represented Great Falls. Oh, here's the con-con. There's Geraldine. She's still around. She lives now in Albuquerque, I believe, Geraldine Travis. But she represented Great Falls in the Montana House of Representatives in the 1975 session. When she moved to Great Falls in 1967, Travis became active in local civil rights and the Democratic Party political activities. In 1968, she was one of the founding members of the Great Falls branch of the NAACP and served as secretary-treasurer. She was also the founder of the Montana chapter of the National Council of Negro Women and the Montana Women's Political Caucus. And in 1972, she became active in the Shirley Chisholm presidential campaign. Later that year, she was one of 20 Montana delegates of the Democratic National Convention in Miami, Florida. Travis is also one of the 15-member Montana Advisory Committee on the U.S. Civil Rights Commission. In 1974, Geraldine Travis was elected to the Montana House of Representatives from House District 43, which represented the Malmstrom community of some 5,500 people. With her election, Travis became the first African American to serve in the Montana legislature. Since most Air Force personnel maintained voting residency in other states, only 138 voters registered for this election in her ward. The base commander prohibited campaigning on base housing areas, so voter turnout was light, and Geraldine Travis was elected by just 20 votes. She served with distinction and great success, but was not reelected in 1976. She remained active in Montana state and local affairs until moving to Arizona in 1989. To this date, oh, she's in Arizona, that's right, she's in Phoenix, not Albuquerque. To this date, she's the only African American person to serve in the Montana legislature. More recent laws have addressed racial profiling, creating sentencing enhancements for offenses committed because of a victim's race, creed, or religion, and clarified that sentences handed down to those convicted of a crime must be neutral with respect to the offender's race. The Billings Not in Our Town documentary and movement reveals a strong sense of social justice that much of the city embraces. The 1995 film documents how ordinary citizens in Billings, Montana joined together to stand up to hate when their neighbors were under attack by white supremacists. As the Not in Our Town website explains, quote, townspeople of all races and religions found common ground against hate-based attacks against their African American, Native American, and Jewish families and congregations. Religious and community leaders, labor union volunteers, local enforcement of the law, and the local newspaper united in action and spoke loudly against hate and intolerance. Through their actions, the people of Billings, Montana have been given an amazing gift. Their story has inspired others around the country to create new ways to stand together when neighbors are under attack. And in the end, I'd like to just say that we're all indebted to these tireless, selfless efforts of many generations of Black Montanans, from those who endured violence and discrimination to those who fought against racist systems in place in Montana and across the nation. And that was a lot, but that's my talk. So I'm happy to answer any questions you guys might have. Anyone? Oh, yes.
According to some research I did, is it correct that white voting males determined when a territory became a state?
I believe so.
Of a certain age?
Yes, when a territory had a certain threshold of population, of the voting population, then it could be considered for statehood.
So even though blacks gained suffrage in the 1870s, their vote wasn't counted towards statehood?
Oh, that would make sense, and that's probably, no, because the federal law, the 13th Amendment guaranteed suffrage for all men.
Yes, all men, all
Right.
black males.
All black males.
So even though in Montana, black males gained suffrage in the 1870s, their vote wasn't counted towards
I'm not positive about that, but I think because the territory gave black men the right to vote under the Territorial Voting Act, I think that Montana counted its votes and voted to become a state. I'm pretty sure that that's how that worked, rather than somebody at the federal level only counting white voters in Montana.
Okay.
Right.
Thank you.
I believe that that's the case.
So they helped Montana gain statehood.
They helped Montana gain statehood,
Great.
for sure. And similarly in Wyoming, Wyoming was the first state in the Union, territory in the Union to give suffrage to women. And they did that, now that I'm thinking about your question, and they did that because they wanted to become a state and they wanted more eligible voters, was one of the incentives. There's always an ulterior motive, right?
Thank you.
Yeah. Anyone else? Well, thank you. I hope that you come and see the documentary. I know I gave you a lot of names and dates and information. It was kind of like a big download. The documentary really focuses more on families and concentrates on those largest communities during the late 19th and early 20th centuries, and then more focused on Great Falls after the mid-20th century, where the largest black communities were living. But Billings was right there, had the second largest African American population after 1950, I think. And today there are 120,000 people about in Billings, is that right? And I looked it up, and there are 1,200 black people registered in the census. So still that 1%, the population, African American population in Montana never exceeded 2%. And then went down considerably during the middle of the 20th century. And right now it's just starting to regain the numbers that we saw at the turn of the 20th century. Very good. Well, I hope I see you this evening. Thanks so much.